talking about like politics and things like that, I have the first question from the audience,
yes.
from Henrik in Hamburg. Do you see political ideas or thoughts in Star Trek that should be realized in current politics?
And I'm not quite grasping that. Say that again. He says,
It's like
the ideas of
political ideas, thoughts in Star Trek that were shown in Star Trek that could affect the modern life.
Should affect. They should be some of the rules. Well, absolutely. I mean, it's ideal to say that one of the prime directives of Star Trek is non-interference, right? Go down to the planet, and we're not interfering. It's against the rule. But there's no story unless you interfere. So, we go down to the planet, and say, what are you doing? You know, and have the story told. Yes, the rules of Star Trek, of love and all the ideal things that Roddenberry thought of are the rules of Star Trek. But in order to tell a passionate, action-filled story, you need conflict, so you've got to invent conflict. In fact, after the Star Trek I was in, The Next Generation came about, and I did a documentary on the trouble that The Next Generation had. When Roddenberry, by this time, this was now, maybe 10 years later, not quite sure of the exact time, but maybe 10 years after he started, the original Star Trek, The Next Generation began. And by that time, Roddenberry had evolved to saying, in the future, there will be no conflict. So now he told the writers, you have to follow that. There can be no conflict in Star Trek because they've evolved beyond that. So the writers said, well, how do we tell the story? That's your problem. And that was the conflict on The Next Generation for 2 or 3 years until Roddenberry died. Roddenberry died and they started telling conflicting stories. Stories of conflict. No, that was, what happened was there was like a rebellion. There was a lot of drama going on behind the scenes in The Next Generation because of this edict. And so when writers would come in and they'd say, well, I've got this story where
Jean-Luc.
That's it. Where Picard has to fight no, Picard wouldn't fight nobody. And they had to surmount that. And how they did that, I don't know, especially in the first year. But by the second or third year, they had gained their stride, and away they went.
Could you tell us something about working with Gene Roddenberry?
Well, Gene Roddenberry had been a policeman. He had been a pilot for one of the major airlines, and he had always wanted to write. So out of his experiences of flight and organization and being a policeman, cop, he had seen life in its rawness, seen the good life, the bad life, and out of that, because he had this vivid imagination and he was very creative, he brought about this idea of a spaceship patrolling the outer reaches of the galaxy, alone on the ship, just the crew, dealing with these entities that were good and bad and beneficial and harmful. And that was his premise. Then he had the sense to hire the best people to write and direct and act. And he put this all together. Now, what was of interest to me was that writers, for the most part, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, writers, for the most part, become writers because they can't deal with people. They would rather be hauled off in a room and writing, conjecturing a story and not dealing with people. There began, at some point in television, a writer/producer. Now, the producer has to deal with people. You shouldn't be doing that. You've got to do that. You're fired. You're hired. And he's making life and death decisions with people, which is the antithesis of what a writer would like to do. So a writer-producer is in conflict from the beginning. And that was part of Gene Roddenberry's problem, I think. He preferred to be alone in a room writing a lovely story as against dealing with people. So he was successful and unsuccessful. And just to continue the story, we made the first 13 hours of Star Trek. And by that time, management at Paramount said, "You're great, Gene. You should be an executive producer, and we'll put somebody else in." So for the next 2.5 years, Gene had very little to do with the day-to-day running of Star Trek that I was in. Then Star Trek is canceled, and everybody goes their way, including Gene. And 10 years later, management is saying, "We got to do something about a film." What was the name of that guy who did that 3 years? Roddenberry. Let's get Roddenberry. So they get Roddenberry to produce the movies. He's equally unskilled with people making the movies. So they kick him upstairs, becomes the executive producer, and other people produce the movies. And that's the way that went.